Chapter 1. The Inciting Incident. In the velvet hush of midnight, the waves lapped hungrily at the stone foundations of the grand Havisham Hotel, a jewel perched atop the Cornish cliffs, crowned by moonlight and mist. Inside, laughter and the clink of crystal drifted from the ballroom, where the annual regatta gala was reaching its luminous peak. Silk gowns shimmered like the sea at dawn. Pearls and secrets dangled from the necks of the finest families on England's southern coast. Outside, a storm brewed, unseen but sensed, the air heavy with electricity and the faint, briny tang of change. At the heart of this glittering gathering stood the guest of honour, Commander Charles Duval, a man as hard and sharp as the compass rose he wore on his lapel. Duval, famed navigator and war hero, had returned from years of silence at sea with a memoir set to scandalize both admiralty and aristocracy. His tales promised revelations of lost gold, wartime betrayals, and the ambiguous fate of the ill-starred HMS Montisfera, a vessel that had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only rumors and a handful of ruined lives. Tonight, Duval was to announce the final chapter of his memoir. The room was thick with anticipation and veiled animosity. Lady Imogen Havisham, silver-haired owner of the hotel, fluttered beside Duval with a brittle smile. Lord Roland Bexley, his old rival, kept to the bar, his glass seldom empty, eyes narrowed with the bitterness of a man who had lost more than just a ship. There was Eleanor Sinclair, the dazzling widow with storm clouds in her eyes, whose late husband had been Montisfera's first officer. Dr. Martin Sinclair, her brother-in-law, lurked at her elbow, his medical gaze darting with suspicion. At the periphery, a scattering of journalists, faded relatives, and anxious staff filled the spaces between the truly powerful, all drawn by the magnetic pull of scandal and legacy. Duval raised his glass, his voice slicing through the reverie. "My friends, old and new, tonight I intend to set a few records straight." A hush fell. "I have in my possession an object recovered from the wreck of the Montisfera, a navigational instrument of extraordinary significance. Some say it points not only to lost gold, but to the soul of a man." The air shimmered with unspoken history. He paused, smiling a thin, enigmatic smile, then glanced down at the ornate box by his side. "But first, one last toast." The crowd leaned in. The storm outside battered the windows with renewed force, lightning tracing the edges of the glass. Duval lifted the box's lid. A single scream shattered the hush, for in that moment the ballroom's lights flickered, the box toppled, and Commander Duval collapsed, his glass tumbling from his grasp, red wine blooming like blood across the marble floor. Chaos erupted. Lady Imogen fainted, Lord Bexley cursed. Eleanor Sinclair's cry caught and twisted in her throat. The navigational compass, the centerpiece of Duval's revelation, lay shattered on the floor, its needle spinning madly. The hotel staff rushed forward, but Duval was already lost, face drained, lips twisted, as if in the middle of an unspeakable confession. Dr. Sinclair's attempts at revival were futile. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was transformed, no longer a scene of triumph, but one of calamity and accusation. In the confusion, one guest slipped out onto the rain-soaked terrace, unseen by all but the vigilant doorman. Later, it would be said that the storm reached its crescendo at that precise instant, as if the sea itself recoiled from the shadow that had fallen over Havisham. The authorities were summoned. The hotel was locked down. Every guest, staff member, and lingering secret was now contained within the gilded cage of the Grand Havisham Hotel. Somewhere among them a murderer waited, silent as the tide, cunning as the shifting wind. And already a rumour began to coil through the crowd. Hercule Poirot, legendary detective, guest of Lady Imogen herself, had arrived earlier that day, his little grey cells primed for the darkness soon to unfold. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The ballroom was in chaos. A flurry of anxious voices, the clatter of hurried feet, and the sharp sounds of the storm outside collided in a cacophony of confusion. Hercule Poirot, standing in the farthest corner of the room, observed the scene with the quiet detachment of a man used to the commotion of human folly. His sharp eyes, dark as the storm itself, flicked from one suspect to another, taking in every detail, the stifled sobs, the darting glances, the clenched fists. His impeccable mind was already working, collecting fragments of truth from the vast ocean of uncertainty. Lady Imogen Havisham, pale and trembling, was guided to a chair by her son Gregory. She was still in shock, her face a mask of grief and disbelief. Lord Roland Bexley, always quick to assume control in any situation, stood at the bar, muttering to a police officer who had arrived only moments ago. His voice, smooth and practiced, seemed out of place in the room filled with such raw emotion. Eleanor Sinclair, her face hidden behind the veil of her fan, clutched her brother-in-law's arm tightly. The doctor, meanwhile, maintained a stoic composure, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the room with quiet suspicion. Poirot's eyes swept back to the body of Commander Duval, now draped under a heavy cloth. His presence at the centre of this tragedy seemed almost symbolic. An iron man, a stoic navigator, felled not by the perils of the sea, but by something far more human, something far darker. The object Duval had revealed to the crowd, the navigational compass, was nowhere to be seen. It had disappeared in the pandemonium following the murder, and Poirot knew at once that this was no coincidence. Turning to the officers now fanning out across the room, Poirot's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Do not disturb the scene further. I shall take the lead in this matter. I insist." His French accent carried an air of authority, a calm authority that none dared challenge. The officers, both baffled by the sudden arrival of the famous detective and relieved by his confidence, nodded in silent acquiescence. Poirot knelt beside the fallen commander, his eyes scanning the floor for anything at all, that could be of significance. He noted the way the wine had spilled from Duval's glass, its crimson trail stark against the polished marble floor. No one had noticed it before, but Poirot's keen eye did not miss the faint smear of blood along the edge of the broken crystal. He carefully reached for the nearest piece of shattered glass, inspecting it with the tenderness of a man handling an ancient relic. The shard was slick with the wine and the blood. No, not just the blood. Poirot leaned in closer, his nose twitching as he detected something faint, something out of place. A sharp, metallic odour lingered in the air, not of blood, but of a chemical scent. Poison, he mused, his mind quickening. Turning to Dr. Sinclair, Poirot spoke with precision. "Monsieur Sinclair, might I ask you to examine the body more closely? I suspect something beyond the obvious." His voice was low, a quiet challenge to the doctor's professional judgment. The doctor's lips pressed into a thin line as he nodded curtly and moved toward the body, his fingers expertly pressing against the pulse in Duval's neck. Lady Imogen, her hands wringing nervously, approached Poirot. "What do you mean by something beyond the obvious?" she asked, her voice quivering with concern. "What do you know?" Poirot looked at her, his gaze soft but piercing. "Madame, there is more here than just a simple death. The commander's demise is but the opening move in a much larger game, one that involves everyone in this room. But what game is it? Ah, that, my dear lady, is what I shall discover." As Dr. Sinclair stood, his face inscrutable, Poirot continued to study the room. "You see, no one here is entirely innocent. No one here is above suspicion. But the truth, the true truth, lies somewhere in the silence between the clues." Just then, a sharp cry rang out from the far end of the room. Eleanor Sinclair, eyes wide, pointed toward the broken window where the storm had burst open the frame. There, in the midst of the maelstrom, was the navigational compass, its glass gleaming faintly under the dim light. Poirot's gaze locked onto the object, a calculating glint in his eye. The compass, he thought, was the key to the puzzle. It had not fallen by accident. Someone had taken it, hidden it, and in doing so, they had sealed their fate. The game was afoot. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The storm outside had not abated. In fact, it had grown fiercer, its howl pressing against the thick stone walls of the Grand Havisham Hotel, as though the very atmosphere were complicit in the chaos that had unfolded inside. Hercule Poirot stood near the far end of the ballroom, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as the officers began to gather the guests in the large drawing-room. One by one they were ushered into the room, each person more wary than the last. All were suspects now, whether they knew it or not. Poirot's sharp gaze flicked over each individual as they entered, his mind working furiously. Lady Imogen, still pale and trembling, clung to her son's arm. Gregory Havisham, tall, well-dressed, and looking more like a sailor than a man of high society, appeared outwardly calm, but there was something tight in his posture, a nervousness that betrayed him. Lord Roland Bexley was already holding court in the corner, his conversation with an officer seemingly unaffected by the tragedy that had just unfolded. Eleanor Sinclair, her eyes red-rimmed, was flanked by her brother-in-law, Dr. Martin Sinclair, who wore a mask of composure but could not hide the subtle tension in his jaw. The others filtered in too, a haphazard assortment of servants, journalists, and acquaintances. The air was thick with the weight of the unknown, the unease spreading like wildfire. And yet, despite the storm's fury, it was Poirot who stood at the centre of this swirling storm, calm and composed as always. "Now," Poirot murmured, his voice almost lost amid the hushed murmurs of the room, "we shall begin." He turned to the officers who had gathered the suspects in groups, each person standing slightly apart from the others, as if subconsciously aware of the suspicion that clung to them all. "It is essential that each of you tell me what you know. I shall question you in turn, and I shall expect nothing less than the truth." Lady Imogen's eyes flicked nervously toward Poirot. "What is it that you suspect?" she asked, her voice trembling. Poirot's gaze softened as he fixed his eyes on her. "Madame, I do not yet know the full story. But as you may well know, no one is ever quite as they seem. Your guests tonight, all of them have something to hide, some secret or motive buried deep beneath the surface." Eleanor Sinclair stiffened at this remark. "Are you saying we're all to be treated as criminals?" she demanded, her voice rising with indignation. Poirot's gaze held steady. "I say only this. Every one of you had access to the scene. Each one of you could have taken the life of Commander Duval. Each of you stands to benefit from his death in some way, shape, or form." Eleanor shot a glance at her brother-in-law, Doctor Sinclair, who remained inscrutable. He had not yet spoken, but his eyes were constantly moving, calculating. Poirot noted this and filed it away for later. "The commander's last words," Poirot continued, pacing slowly in front of the assembly, "was something to the effect of a final revelation, a secret, an announcement. Perhaps he had information that could change the very course of many lives here. But who would want him silenced before the truth came out? He paused, letting the tension hang in the air, thick and palpable. Who here has a secret worth killing for? Gregory Havisham, his arm still linked to his mother's, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes met Poirot's, a flash of something unreadable flickering in his gaze before he quickly looked away. Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. This man was hiding something, of that he was sure. "Lord Bexley," Poirot addressed the older man, whose demeanour remained composed despite the mounting tension. "You appear unfazed. Could it be that your experience with power has steeled you against such events?" Lord Bexley's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I have seen much in my time, Monsieur Poirot, but I hardly believe I am the man to answer questions about a murder that I had no part in." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Perhaps not, my lord, but your presence at the scene places you in the centre of this drama." He turned his attention next to Eleanor and Doctor Sinclair, who stood side by side, their body language locked in subtle but undeniable tension. "Ah, but you, Madame Sinclair," Poirot said, focusing on Eleanor, "and your dear brother-in-law, Dr. Sinclair, was it not? You both had far more than the average motive. Perhaps Commander Duval knew something of your family's affairs. Did he threaten you with this knowledge? Could that have been enough to prompt murder?" Eleanor's hand flew to her chest, her breath catching. "You are mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot silenced her with a raised hand. "No, no, madam. The truth is often more hidden than one would expect." He turned back to the group. "Each of you is a suspect, and no one, not even Lady Imogen, is exempt from scrutiny. You have all been touched by this crime. But one of you, I believe, is the key to unravelling the mystery." Lady Imogen looked at Poirot, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You believe one of us is guilty?" Poirot's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Oh, madame, I do not believe it. I know it. But it is not enough to know, one must prove it." As Poirot surveyed the room once more, he was struck by the realization that each person here held a thread, a crucial piece of the puzzle. And somewhere in the tangled web of lies, deception, and hidden motives, the truth waited, silent, just beyond reach. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The guests of the Grand Havisham Hotel, still unsettled by the shock of Commander Duval's sudden death, shifted nervously from one foot to the other. The grand drawing-room, once a symbol of elegance, now felt like a cage. Every person here was confined by suspicion and unease. Hercule Poirot stood at the far end of the room, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him. The storm outside had not let up, and its fury matched the tension in the room. Yet Poirot remained calm, unshaken, as though he were a quiet observer rather than an active participant in the unfolding drama. Lady Imogen had been sitting at a small table, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped from a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her sharp eyes, once the epitome of grace and poise, now darted nervously around the room, focusing on nothing in particular. It was clear that the death of Commander Duval had shaken her more than she let on. But Poirot could see past the mask of composure. She was afraid not only for her hotel and her guests, but of something much darker that she could not yet fully comprehend. "Lady Imogen," Poirot said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "You are troubled, I see. Troubled by more than just the death of your guest, I suspect." Imogen's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice faltering ever so slightly. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze piercing through her defences. "Madame, you wear a face of worry, yes, but it is the kind of worry that speaks of more than a mere murder. It speaks of something you have known, something you have kept hidden, perhaps even from yourself." Imogen swallowed, the corners of her mouth twitching in what might have been a smile, but was more like a grimace. "I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I have nothing to hide. What could I possibly—" Poirot raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I do not doubt that you believe so, madame, but I must ask, does your hotel have any secrets? And I mean, truly, secrets that might explain why such an event occurred under your roof, perhaps something that was not meant for others to find?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Lady Imogen's face paled, and for the briefest moment, Poirot saw something flicker in her eyes. It was gone before he could fully grasp it, but he noted it nonetheless. Before Imogen could respond, Gregory Havisham, who had been pacing near the door, stepped forward, his expression strained. "Poirot, enough with these insinuations," he said, his voice sharp. "We are all here to find the truth, not to play games. The commander is dead, and we need to focus on that, not on irrelevant conjecture." Poirot's gaze shifted to Gregory, studying him for a moment before he replied in his usual calm, measured tone. "Mon cher, it is precisely because we seek the truth that we must entertain all possibilities, for the truth, you see, is often hidden in the smallest of details." Gregory bristled at the implication. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Eleanor Sinclair intervened, her voice barely above a whisper but laced with urgency. "Enough, all of you." She looked at Poirot, then turned to her brother-in-law, Dr. Sinclair. "This is madness. We should be looking for a way out, not pointing fingers at each other." Poirot's eyes glinted as he turned his attention to her. "Ah, Madame Sinclair, you are not wrong. There is much to consider and much to be learned from each other. But there is one thing that is certain. No one here is entirely without guilt." Dr. Martin Sinclair, who had been standing at the edge of the room, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost too calm for the situation. "What do you suggest we do, Poirot? Will your little grey cells provide us with an answer, or will they only lead to more questions?" Poirot smiled, a slight, enigmatic expression that never fully reached his eyes. "I do not yet have the answer, monsieur, but I will find it. I am like a fisherman, casting my line into the waters, waiting for the smallest of clues to bite. Once I have that, you will have your answer. But first, we must wait, for all things in their time." As Poirot spoke, his sharp eyes moved from one person to another, noting their reactions. He could feel the weight of their gazes upon him, the mixture of skepticism and apprehension. But one thing was clear: Poirot had already made up his mind. He knew there was more at play here than the simple murder of an ambitious naval officer. Something deeper, more sinister, was brewing beneath the surface. The storm outside raged on, and within the walls of the Grand Havisham Hotel, the storm of secrets continued to swirl, trapping everyone inside. Poirot's eyes narrowed. It was only a matter of time before he would find the key that would unlock the truth and bring the darkness into the light. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly, its steady rhythm marking the silence that hung in the drawing-room. Hercule Poirot stood beside the hearth, his hands clasped in front of him, watching his suspects closely. The tension in the room had thickened since the storm had started its furious attack on the hotel. The once luxurious space now felt like a pressure cooker, the quiet whispers of the guests like the muffled hum of anxiety barely contained. Lady Imogen, still pale, was seated near the fireplace, her eyes focused on Poirot. but her mind seemed far away. Her son, Gregory, stood by the window, arms crossed, occasionally glancing outside, his face an unreadable mask. Eleanor Sinclair and Dr. Martin Sinclair sat at opposite ends of the room, their posture rigid, betraying their unease. Lord Bexley had long since moved to a corner, nursing a drink that had now gone undisturbed. Poirot's sharp eyes took in every movement, every subtle change in body language, no matter how minor. The smallest gestures, the slightest shift in posture, all of it meant something. To him, they were all just pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Now we shall begin," Poirot announced, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence like a knife. He turned to the officers who had gathered at the door. "Monsieur Dubois, you will begin by conducting the interviews. I will observe, but I expect no deviation from the order I have set. Understood?" The officer, who had been looking nervously at Poirot's composed figure, nodded, adjusting his cap nervously. "Understood, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's gaze shifted back to the group, settling first on Gregory Havisham. "You will be the first, Monsieur Havisham," he said softly, his tone deliberate, almost casual. Gregory stiffened, but nodded stiffly, his eyes narrowing. He was not pleased to be the first in the spotlight. "Please sit," Poirot gestured to the chair across from him, and Gregory did so reluctantly, his fingers tapping a subtle rhythm on the armrest. Poirot sat across from him, the sharpness in his eyes more intense than before. He allowed the silence to settle between them, watching as Gregory fidgeted uncomfortably. Poirot, of course, was not in a rush. He had all the time in the world. The clues would come to him piece by piece, whether his suspects were ready or not. "Tell me, Monsieur Havisham," Poirot began, his voice soft yet probing, "what is your opinion on the death of Commander Duval?" Gregory's eyes flicked toward his mother for just a moment, before he refocused on Poirot. "It's a terrible tragedy," he said, his voice neutral, "but I hardly see how I can be of any help. We were all guests here. We all witnessed the same thing." Poirot studied him, his brow furrowing slightly. "Ah, yes. But surely you have your own thoughts on the matter. Tell me, what was the commander planning to reveal tonight? You were in the room when he spoke, non?" Gregory's hand stilled on the armrest, and for the briefest moment, Poirot saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps guilt, or, more likely, fear. It passed too quickly for Poirot to grasp fully, but it was enough to confirm that Gregory was hiding something. "He was going to announce something," Gregory said, his voice steady but lacking conviction. "Some sort of new revelation. I don't know what it was, but... well, that's for the police to figure out." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You do not know what he was going to reveal?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Gregory's response was a little too quick, little too rehearsed. Gregory hesitated, swallowing. "Number, I didn't know." Poirot studied him for another moment, noting the subtle clench of his jaw. "But you were very close to him, were you not? You must have known something about his plans." Gregory shifted in his seat, discomfort clear on his face. He was hiding something, Poirot was certain of it. But before Poirot could press further, Officer Dubois cleared his throat from the doorway. "Monsieur Poirot," he called, his voice laced with hesitation. "Dr. Sinclair is ready for his interview." Poirot paused, his gaze still fixed on Gregory. "Very well. You may go, monsieur."
"Havisham," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But remember, you are still under observation. Every word you speak will be carefully considered." Gregory stood quickly, his face flushed, and left the room without another word. Poirot's eyes followed him out, his mind racing through the possibilities. What had he been hiding? Why had he seemed so nervous under Poirot's scrutiny? As Gregory exited, Dr. Sinclair moved forward to take his place.
The doctor's cool demeanour was in stark contrast to Gregory's, but Poirot noticed something in his eyes as well, a certain guardedness that made him wary. The doctor sat, his posture precise and calculated, betraying no emotion, no vulnerability. He was a man who had spent his life observing the human body, but perhaps he was not as adept at reading the mind. Poirot did not waste time. "Dr. Sinclair," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "you are familiar with the commander's death, no? What is your assessment?" Dr. Sinclair's response was measured, controlled. "A tragic event," he said, his voice cool and detached. "But I've already examined the body. It was obvious from the start that this was a case of poisoning." Poirot's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. Poisoning? And yet the wine, the glass, it was clear enough to suggest otherwise. "What makes you so certain, Doctor? Sinclair?" Dr. Sinclair's expression remained unchanged, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes. "You can't be serious, Monsieur Poirot. We are all familiar with the signs." Poirot's eyes held steady on him. "Yes, Monsieur Sinclair. But what if you are wrong?" Chapter 6. First false lead. The atmosphere in the drawing-room had become stifling, each breath drawn with increasing difficulty. The tension from the ongoing interviews was palpable, and Hercule Poirot could sense the growing discomfort among the guests. Every word, every gesture was now under scrutiny. Each response seemed carefully crafted, but Poirot knew that beneath their composed facades the truth was hiding, waiting to be uncovered. Dr. Sinclair sat across from Poirot, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face unreadable. The doctor's calm was almost too perfect, too calculated. Poirot wasn't fooled. He knew Sinclair was hiding something, that his calm demeanour was a mask that would crack under pressure. But for now, Poirot had no intention of breaking him completely. The key lay in the details, in the subtle discrepancies that would slowly unravel the mystery. "You mentioned earlier, Doctor, Sinclair," Poirot began, his voice smooth and unhurried, "that this was a case of poisoning. Yet, as I have observed, the circumstances surrounding the commander's death do not entirely align with that theory." Sinclair's expression remained unchanged, but Poirot noticed the faintest flicker of tension in his eyes. "I am certain of my assessment," he replied, his voice calm, but defensive. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "But you see, Monsieur Sinclair, there are inconsistencies in your theory that cannot be ignored." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "The commander's glass contained wine, yes? And yet the signs of poisoning, well, they do not match. There was no immediate reaction, no signs of distress before his collapse." Dr. Sinclair shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. "There could be many explanations for that. The poison could have taken time to act. Or perhaps the wine was not the source at all." Poirot's lips curled into a slight smile. "Ah, you admit there is room for doubt, then?" "I find that interesting, Monsieur Sinclair. For a man of your expertise, I would have expected a more definitive explanation." Sinclair's jaw clenched. Poirot could see the struggle beneath the surface. "I'm simply stating that we do not have all the facts yet," Sinclair replied, his voice tight. Poirot allowed the silence to linger, sensing the doctor was starting to unravel. "Indeed, but what if the poisoning theory is a diversion? What if it's too simple, too obvious?" Sinclair's gaze faltered for just a moment, a crack in his composure. Poirot seized the moment. "I suspect that the poison, if there was any, was planted after the commander's death, perhaps even after his collapse. It would explain why no immediate symptoms were visible. It is a false lead designed to send us down the wrong path. Dr. Sinclair's face paled slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That is a wild accusation, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low, tinged with anger. "We are dealing with a death here, not a game of deduction." Poirot ignored the doctor's words, his mind racing through the possibilities. Wild, yes, but not impossible. Perhaps the real cause of death is something more mundane, a heart attack, perhaps, or a stroke. And yet here we are, focused on the theory of poisoning. Dr. Sinclair relaxed ever so slightly, but Poirot noticed the eagerness with which he dismissed the theory. It was a classic defense mechanism, an attempt to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable truths. "The problem with this theory," Poirot continued, "is that it distracts us from the real question. Why would someone go to such lengths to frame the commander's death as poisoning? What was the true motive behind the murder?" Dr. Sinclair met Poirot's gaze, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you expect from me, Poirot. I have already told you everything I know." Poirot smiled faintly. "Oh, I believe you know much more, Monsieur Sinclair. You are a man of science, after all. And yet, you're not as scientific in your approach as you claim to be. You've let emotion cloud your judgment." Sinclair stiffened at the accusation. "Emotion? You think I'm emotional?" Poirot's eyes remained steady. "Yes, Monsieur Sinclair, and that's precisely why I believe you know more than you've let on." The doctor clenched his fists, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. Poirot saw the fear in his eyes now, the fear of being exposed, but Poirot did not press him further, not yet. The first false lead had been cast, but it had not gone as planned. Sinclair's discomfort was telling, but it did not confirm guilt. As Dr. Sinclair stood to leave, he shot one final glance at Poirot. "You'll find nothing here, Poirot, nothing but more questions." Poirot watched him leave, his mind already turning over the latest development. Sinclair's resistance only added to his suspicions. The mystery deepened with every word spoken, and Poirot knew that the true culprit was growing more desperate to cover their tracks. The game was far from over. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The rain lashed against the windows, its rhythmic pounding matching the growing tension in the room. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his mind working through the threads of the case. The interviews had just begun, but already the weight of the mystery pressed down on him. He could feel that the truth was buried just beneath the surface, and each guest in the room had a role to play in its unveiling. Lady Imogen sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes focused on the flames. Gregory Havisham paced back and forth, his long strides betraying his restless energy. Eleanor Sinclair sat near the window, her gaze distant. Poirot had noticed the way her jaw tightened whenever Dr. Sinclair had been questioned. The tension between them was palpable, though neither spoke of it aloud. Poirot's eyes flicked between them, his mind analyzing their motivations and weaknesses. The game, as it were, was afoot. But it was not about simple facts or obvious clues. It was about understanding the psychology of those who sought to deceive. "Lady Imogen," Poirot said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Might I have a word?" Lady Imogen looked up, her eyes clouded with confusion. "Yes, of course, Monsieur Poirot," she replied softly, her voice lacking its usual warmth. Poirot motioned for her to join him by the fireplace. As she approached, he noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way her gaze flicked away from his. Beneath her composed exterior, something simmered, a struggle she was trying to hide. "Monsieur Poirot," Lady Imogen began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have nothing more to say. You've questioned everyone. You must know more than I." Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her. "Ah, madam, that is where you are mistaken. I do not know it all. I only know what you choose to reveal, and you, madam, reveal much, even without speaking." Her eyes flicked to the side, avoiding his gaze. Poirot could see the faintest flicker of something in her expression. Fear, guilt. The same flicker he had seen in Gregory's eyes. "You are troubled," Poirot continued gently. "Not by the commander's death alone, I think, but by something else. There is more here, madame, something that weighs on you. It is no shame to admit it." Lady Imogen pressed her lips together, her hands now tightly clasped in front of her. She sat in silence for a long moment. Poirot waited. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what you want from me. The commander's death, it is a tragedy, but I have no part in it. I don't even know why he came here. Why would he come to my hotel to die?" Poirot regarded her quietly. "That is an excellent question, madame. Why would he come to your hotel? It does not seem a place of choice for a man of his stature, and yet he was here. And now he is dead. What was his connection to you, I wonder?" Lady Imogen's breath caught, and Poirot saw panic flash in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words faltered. "The truth, madame," Poirot said softly, "is a powerful thing. It can free us, but it can also bind us, especially when we are too afraid to face it. I have no intention of hurting you, but I must ask, did you and the commander share more than just a casual acquaintance?" The question hung in the air. Lady Imogen's face went pale. Poirot could see the crack in her composure. Before she could respond, Gregory Havisham strode over, his voice sharp. "That is enough, Poirot," he said. "My mother has no part in this. She's been through enough. You're making her suffer." Poirot turned his gaze to Gregory, his expression unchanged. "Monsieur Havisham, I am merely seeking the truth. Your mother may hold a key to the mystery. I would ask that you allow me to continue." Gregory's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, stiff and tense. Lady Imogen glanced at him, then back at Poirot, her shoulders sagging in resignation. "You are right, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There is something, but I don't know if I can tell you. I don't know if I can face it." Poirot regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "You must, madam. The truth, no matter how difficult, is the only path to peace for all of us." She nodded slowly, as if accepting that the moment had come. Poirot knew the truth was within reach. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. The rain had intensified, its relentless pounding against the windows matching the growing tension inside the Grand Havisham Hotel. Once a place of luxury and elegance, the hotel now felt more like a fortress, isolated from the world by the storm and the mounting pressure within. Poirot stood at the window, his back to the room, hands clasped behind him. He had observed Lady Imogen's reaction carefully, noting the flicker of fear and guilt in her eyes when he had pressed her about her connection to Commander Duval. But she had not been ready to speak. Poirot could sense there was more to her silence than just grief. There was a truth buried beneath layers of reluctance, and he intended to uncover it. "Madame," Poirot said, breaking the silence with a firm yet calm voice, "I understand that this is difficult, but I must ask again, what was the nature of your relationship with Commander Duval? It is crucial to understanding why he chose to come here." Lady Imogen's eyes darted briefly toward the door, as if seeking an escape, but then she quickly looked away. She was caught between the urge to speak and the fear of what the truth might cost her. I do not know what you want from me, Poirot," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have told you all I can." Poirot turned slowly, facing her fully. "You are not being entirely truthful, madame, and that, I fear, is what will prevent us from finding the answers we seek." Before Lady Imogen could respond, a sharp, urgent knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "It seems that we have been interrupted," he remarked with mild amusement, though his eyes remained fixed on Lady Imogen. "Please, do not go far. I shall return shortly." Lady Imogen nodded, her expression still strained but now edged with uncertainty. As Poirot stepped toward the door, he could feel the weight of the unfinished conversation pressing on him. He knew that whatever had happened between Lady Imogen and Duval was the key to unlocking the mystery, but she was not yet ready to reveal it. Opening the door, Poirot was met by a young hotel staff member, clearly flustered. "Monsieur Poirot," the man said quickly, his voice quivering slightly, "there's been another incident." Poirot's expression shifted. "What do you mean, another incident?" The staff member looked around nervously. "A theft, sir. A letter. It was meant to be delivered to Lady Imogen this evening." Poirot's curiosity piqued. "Where is the letter now?" We don't know, Monsieur Poirot," the staff member replied, his voice low. "But the disappearance was noticed only moments ago. It's as though someone had taken it in plain sight." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A missing letter. A theft on the night of a murder. The connection was too obvious to ignore. He had already suspected that there was something more to the commander's death than met the eye. Now it seemed that a second mystery had emerged, one that could reveal even deeper layers of deception. "I see," Poirot said, his tone calm but measured. "Please, show me where it happened. I shall take care of it." The staff member led Poirot down a narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The hotel, once lively, now felt eerily quiet, the sound of the storm outside mixing with the silence within. Poirot's mind raced as they walked. A letter meant for Lady Imogen. Could it hold the key to understanding Duval's death? Too many pieces were falling into place at once. They arrived at a small study where the theft had been discovered. The room was dimly lit, heavy curtains drawn against the storm. The desk was cluttered with papers, and several chairs were overturned, as if in a hurry. Poirot stepped inside, eyes scanning the disarray. But it was the faint, oily mark on the edge of the desk that caught his attention. He approached, inspecting it closely. "What is this?" Poirot murmured, his fingers hovering over the dark stain. The staff member, pale-faced, looked over his shoulder. "That's where the letter was kept. It was in an envelope, but now it's gone." Poirot's brow furrowed as he processed the scene. "This is no ordinary theft," he muttered. "Whoever took the letter knew exactly what they were after." The staff member shifted uneasily. "But what else could there be?" Poirot's gaze sharpened as he looked around the room. "I will tell you what there is," he said. "A deeper mystery, one that is connected to the first. A mystery that will reveal itself, one step at a time." As Poirot turned to leave, he could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Though the full truth was still elusive, he knew this was just the beginning. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The storm outside raged on, its fury now blending with the rising tension within the walls of the Grand Havisham Hotel. The missing letter, the oil stain on the desk, and the increasing number of questions without answers All of it pushed Poirot forward, deeper into the web of lies and half-truths that had already ensnared the guests. As he walked back to the drawing room, his mind spun with the implications of the latest development. Someone was covering something up. But what? And why? Poirot's footsteps were soft, measured, as he approached the drawing room once more. He had to think carefully. He had already observed so much, the nervous glances, the subtle defensiveness in each person's posture. But there was still something important missing, a connection, a thread that would tie everything together. Inside, the suspects remained clustered together, each lost in their own thoughts. Lady Imogen, still shaken, had returned to her seat by the fireplace, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her teacup. Gregory Havisham stood by the window once more, his back to the room, clearly agitated. Eleanor Sinclair, her face pale, was leaning toward Dr. Sinclair, speaking in hushed tones. The doctor, as usual, wore his stoic mask, but his eyes betrayed an underlying tension. Poirot's eyes swept over the room, assessing each individual, noting the subtle ways in which they interacted with one another. He knew there was more to the story than what had been revealed. There were hidden connections, relationships that had been carefully obscured, and now they were starting to surface. He cleared his throat gently, breaking the silence. Monsieur Havisham, Madame, Sinclair, Dr. Sinclair, Lady Imogen, if I may have your attention once more, I have discovered something important. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of a revelation, and he saw their eyes snap toward him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Poirot moved slowly toward the center of the room, ensuring that each person could see him clearly. Earlier, I found a stain in the study, oil perhaps or something similar, near where the missing letter had been placed. It is not enough to dismiss it as a mere accident. The letter was taken deliberately, and someone went to great lengths to ensure it remained hidden. But it is not just the letter that holds significance. He paused, letting the room absorb his words. Dr. Sinclair's eyes flickered momentarily. It was brief, but Poirot had caught it. A slight shift in the doctor's posture, a hesitation. "What do you mean, Poirot?" Gregory asked, his voice low, almost defensive. "What connection does a letter have to Duval's murder?" Poirot met his gaze with unwavering calm. "Ah, Monsieur Havisham, it is the connections that make the case, not the surface details. You see, the letter was not just a letter, it was a message, one meant for Lady Imogen, but its contents remain a mystery. And I suspect it holds the key to understanding why the commander was killed." Lady Imogen stiffened at his words, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of her seat. "I don't understand, Poirot. What could a letter possibly have to do with my guest's death?" Poirot's gaze softened, but his mind was already moving, piecing together the jigsaw puzzle of motives and secrets. "Madame, the letter was meant for you, yes? But it was never delivered. Why? And why did someone go to such lengths to ensure that it was taken?" A silence fell over the room, each person mulling over Poirot's words. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Eleanor Sinclair spoke up, her voice tentative but laced with suspicion. "And what of the commander's past? You said there were hidden connections. Was Duval's arrival here mere coincidence, Poirot?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Ah, Madame Sinclair, you are on the right path. The commander's presence here was not accidental. It was deliberate. But it was not his arrival that should concern us. It is what he came to reveal. Duval knew something about the past that connects all of you." Dr. Sinclair's expression hardened at the mention of the past. "You are implying that we are somehow connected to this?" That we have a part in the commander's death. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Indeed, Monsieur Sinclair. You, all of you, are connected by more than just your presence in this hotel. Your pasts, your relationships are tangled in a way that makes this murder far more than just an isolated incident. Gregory bristled at the implication, stepping forward. What do you mean? What are you suggesting? Poirot met his gaze with unflinching calm. I suggest, Monsieur Havisham, that the commander's death was not simply the result of a random act of violence. I suggest that it is the culmination of years of secrets, of betrayals, of emotions long buried. The connections that bind you all are deeper than you know, and one of you holds the key to unraveling the entire truth. The room fell silent again, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. The storm outside roared louder, as if echoing the turmoil now swirling within the drawing-room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Poirot could see the fear beginning to take hold. "You're all hiding something," Poirot said quietly, his voice steady. "And it is only by facing those hidden truths that we will discover who killed Commander Duval, and why." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, but Poirot knew that it was only a matter of time before someone cracked. The game was nearing its end, and soon the truth would come to light. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The storm had begun to subside, its violent winds now a soft, distant murmur. Yet the air inside the Grand Havisham Hotel felt thicker than ever, saturated with the tension of what had been revealed and what still remained hidden. Hercule Poirot stood by the window, his eyes narrowing as he observed the dark clouds slowly parting to reveal a sliver of pale moonlight. The shifting sky mirrored the chaos in the drawing-room behind him, uncertainty, shifting shadows, and the slow, inevitable approach of clarity. The guests were gathered once again, their faces drawn and weary, each of them carrying the weight of the unspoken truth. Poirot had watched them carefully, his mind constantly turning over the puzzle before him. Each person had shown their hand, some more clearly than others, but one piece of the puzzle still eluded him. The truth was close, but it was not yet in his grasp. And that was when it struck him, the key that would unlock everything. Turning back to the room, Poirot took in the faces of Lady Imogen, Gregory Havisham, Eleanor Sinclair, and Dr. Sinclair. They were all present, each of them aware now that Poirot had a deeper understanding of their connections. But there was something more, something subtle, hidden in plain sight. "You see," Poirot began, his voice calm yet heavy with purpose, "the key to understanding the death of Commander Duval lies not in what has been said, but in what has been hidden." He paused, watching their faces carefully. "And there is something, a small detail, something I have just now noticed, which changes everything." Lady Imogen, her face pale and drawn, leaned forward slightly. "What is it, Monsieur Poirot? What have you discovered?" Poirot's eyes locked onto hers. "Madame, you may not even realize it, but there is a subtle connection between all of you, a thread that ties you together. The commander's arrival here was no accident. He came with purpose, with intent, and that purpose is now clearer than ever." Gregory Havisham scoffed, his voice sharp. "Purpose? What are you implying, Poirot, that we were somehow involved in his death?" Poirot held up a hand, silencing him. "Monsieur Havisham, you misunderstand. I do not believe you or any of you intended harm to Commander Duval, but you are all connected to him in ways you do not fully understand. And it is this connection, this hidden thread, that must be unraveled if we are to learn the truth." Eleanor Sinclair shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing at her brother-in-law before speaking. "This is absurd," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You cannot seriously suggest that we are all involved. I barely knew the man. What connection could we possibly have?" Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "Madame Sinclair, you are correct in that you did not know the commander well, but it is not always the obvious connections that lead us to the truth. It is often the small, seemingly inconsequential details that reveal everything." He turned toward Doctor Sinclair, whose eyes had been darting between the others, clearly agitated. "And you, Monsieur Sinclair," Poirot continued, "you have been less forthcoming than I would have liked. There is something you have been hiding, something you have not yet shared with me." The doctor's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists on the armrests of his chair. "I've already told you everything I know," he said, his voice low but strained. Poirot nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this response. Yes, of course, but what you've told me and what you've chosen not to tell me are two different things, Monsieur Sinclair. You see, it is the omission that reveals more than the confession." Dr. Sinclair's face tightened with anger, but Poirot paid him no mind. He was focused on the puzzle, his mind clicking through the various clues, the connections, the layers of deception. There was something here, something that none of them had noticed, but Poirot had. He turned back to the group. "The letter, Madame Imogen," Poirot said, his voice steady but insistent. "The missing letter. I believe it is far more important than any of you realize. And I have a theory. The letter was not just for you. It was meant to be seen by others, and I believe the contents of that letter are the key to understanding why Commander Duval was killed." A chill seemed to pass through the room as the weight of his words sank in. Lady Imogen's face paled further, and Gregory shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Eleanor crossed her arms tightly, her face tight with suspicion. And Dr. Sinclair remained silent, but his expression betrayed his growing unease. Poirot took a step forward, his eyes now burning with intensity. "There is something more to this hotel, something you have all overlooked. The commander's arrival was no accident. The letter, whoever took it, whoever was trying to hide it, was trying to prevent the truth from being revealed." He paused, letting the tension build before continuing. "The key to unlocking this mystery lies in the past. The connections between all of you, your histories with Duval and this letter, it is all connected. And once we find the missing piece, the entire story will be revealed." Poirot's gaze swept over the room once more, his mind working tirelessly, piecing together the connections, the lies, the secrets. It was close, so close. The truth was waiting, but first he needed that final clue, the one that would tie everything together. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The tension in the room had shifted, settling into something thicker, more palpable. The conversation that Poirot had stirred up about the missing letter and its connection to Commander Duval's death had unsettled everyone. It was as if the ground beneath their feet had shifted, and now each one of them was trying to steady themselves in the wake of his revelations. The subtle shifting of glances, the nervous fidgeting, all told Poirot what he needed to know. His suspects were starting to unravel. Lady Imogen sat rigidly in her chair, her knuckles white as she clutched the armrests. Gregory Havisham, still standing near the window, stared out into the rain, his expression unreadable, but Poirot knew better. The momentary flicker of his eyes, the brief glance at his mother, was a tell. Gregory was holding something back. Eleanor Sinclair was the next to speak, her voice strained but assertive. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, "I do not understand what you're implying." You speak of letters and hidden truths, but what does this have to do with Duval's death? Poirot's gaze never wavered as he met her eyes. Madame Sinclair, I have not yet revealed everything, but you must trust that every question I ask, every observation I make, is vital. The truth of the commander's death is hidden in plain sight, and it is bound to the secrets that have been carefully concealed for far too long. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but her brother-in-law, Dr. Sinclair, cut her off, his voice sharp and defensive. Poirot, enough of these insinuations. We're all well aware of the chaos that has erupted in this house. We do not need more of your games. The commander is dead, and we must focus on finding the real cause of his death, not chasing shadows. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Monsieur Sinclair, he said quietly, I do not play games. I seek the truth, and it is only through understanding the lies, the omissions, and the silences that we can uncover what truly happened here. The real cause of the commander's death is more than just a murder. It is a consequence of the secrets that bind you all together. The room fell silent at his words, the weight of his statement pressing down on each of them. Poirot turned his attention back to Lady Imogen, who was still gripping the armrest tightly, her face pale. She had remained silent throughout most of the conversation, but her eyes were darting between the others, her unease palpable. Madame Imogen, Poirot said gently, I understand this is difficult, but I must ask again, why was the commander here? What was the purpose of his visit to your hotel, and why did he bring with him a letter that was so important? Lady Imogen flinched at his words, and Poirot saw the crack in her composure. It was only for a brief moment, but it was enough. She was hiding something, and the truth was close. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot stepped closer, his presence calm but commanding. Madame, it is not enough to deny it. You know more than you are letting on. And the letter, the missing letter, it is at the heart of this mystery. You must trust me when I say that the secrets you are trying to protect are the very things that will lead us to the truth. At this, Gregory Havisham finally turned from the window, his eyes locked on Poirot. You're asking the wrong questions, Poirot, he said, his voice suddenly more controlled. Perhaps you should focus on the people in this room, rather than chasing after something that may not even exist. Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying Gregory closely. There it was again, the subtle, defensive posture, the shift in tone that suggested he was more involved than he wanted to admit. Poirot knew that Gregory was hiding something, but what? He turned away from Gregory and focused on Dr. Sinclair. Monsieur Sinclair, you are a man of science, yes? I would expect that you understand the importance of examining every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. What is it that you are not telling me? Dr. Sinclair's expression hardened, but Poirot could see the hesitation in his eyes. I have told you everything I know, he repeated, his voice stiff. What more do you want from me? Poirot gave him a soft smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. I want the truth, Monsieur Sinclair. And the truth, as I've learned, is often buried beneath layers of fear and pride, but fear, pride, they are not enough to hide what has been done. A tense silence settled over the room once again. Poirot's words had struck a nerve. Lady Imogen's hands, still trembling, twisted the lace of her dress. Gregory shifted from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor Sinclair's gaze was fixed on Poirot, her expression unreadable, but her lips were pressed tightly together, as if she were trying to suppress something. Poirot took a deep breath, his mind working through the layers of deception and half-truths that had been laid before him. The storm outside had calmed, but inside the storm was just beginning. He could feel the pressure mounting, the pressure of a truth that was so close it almost burned. "Madame, Monsieur," Poirot said, his voice steady but laced with purpose. "We are reaching the moment of revelation, but before we can uncover the truth you must all face what you've been hiding. Each of you knows more than you are willing to admit, and it is time for those secrets to come to light." The room grew still, the weight of Poirot's words settling heavily on their shoulders. The game had shifted, and now the pieces were in motion. Someone in this room was about to crack, and Poirot would be ready when they did. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The tension in the drawing room had become almost unbearable, as though the very walls were closing in on the group. Hercule Poirot, ever calm, stood before his audience, each individual more on edge than the last. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, its rhythm echoing the pounding in their hearts, each tick a reminder of the inevitability of truth. They could not hide forever. Lady Imogen was seated by the fire, her fingers nervously clutching her lace handkerchief, her eyes flitting to each person in the room, but never holding any gaze for long. Gregory Havisham, still standing by the window, stared out into the rain, his posture rigid with frustration. Eleanor Sinclair, whose face had paled at Poirot's revelations, was seated beside her brother-in-law, Dr. Sinclair, who looked unusually calm but tightly wound, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Poirot studied them all quietly. Each had shown their hand to some extent, and yet the puzzle pieces remained scattered. The truth was close, too close, and yet it remained elusive, buried beneath layers of lies and misdirection. His mind churned as he carefully selected his next words. "Madame," Poirot began, turning his attention to Lady Imogen, "I must ask you again, what was Commander Duval's purpose in coming here? What was his connection to you?" The question seemed to catch Lady Imogen off guard, and she stiffened in her seat, her knuckles turning white as they gripped the fabric of her chair. "I've already told you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He simply arrived." "I don't know why." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Madam, the truth is rarely so simple. You know more than you are saying, and it is that truth we must uncover." Lady Imogen's gaze flickered nervously to her son, Gregory, before she quickly averted her eyes. "I don't know what you want from me, Poirot," she said again, her voice trembling slightly. Poirot took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You are not being entirely truthful. There is more here than you admit. It is clear to me that the commander's death is not as simple as it appears, and you are holding the key to understanding why he was here and what truly happened to him." Gregory, who had
remained silent, suddenly spoke, his voice sharp and defensive. "Enough, Poirot," he said, his eyes flashing with anger. "You're making accusations that have no basis. My mother has nothing to hide. You're pushing too hard." Poirot turned his gaze to Gregory, his expression unchanged. "Monsieur Havisham, your mother may have nothing to hide, but you, monsieur, are far more invested in this mystery than you let on." Gregory's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening in anger. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded. Poirot held his gaze steadily, watching the subtle shift in Gregory's posture. The young man's nervousness was unmistakable now. "You, monsieur, are hiding something. I can see it in your eyes, and you are more connected to this murder than you are willing to admit." Lady Imogen looked at Gregory with concern, her face etched with worry. "Gregory, please." "I don't know what you mean." Poirot turned to Dr. Sinclair, who had been unusually quiet throughout the exchange. "And you, Monsieur Sinclair," Poirot said, his voice cool. "You have remained steadfast in your silence. But I must ask, what do you know about the commander's death? You were his doctor, after all. Surely you have more to tell us. Dr. Sinclair stiffened, his jaw tightening. I've told you everything, Poirot, he said, his voice controlled, but laced with an undercurrent of frustration. I don't know anything beyond what's already been said. Poirot tilted his head, considering the doctor's response. Ah, but you see, Monsieur Sinclair, it is what you have not said that interests me. The subtle clues you have left unsaid. A doctor's keen eye is capable of many things, but I wonder if you have been too quick to dismiss the obvious. The doctor's face reddened, but he held his ground. I don't know what you're implying, but I assure you I've done nothing wrong. Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. I am not accusing you of anything, Monsieur Sinclair, but I believe you know more than you have let on. I believe that there is something you are afraid to admit, and that is what we must uncover. A heavy silence settled over the room. Lady Imogen's breathing had become shallow, and Gregory's agitation was palpable. Eleanor Sinclair, her face a mask of controlled emotion, shifted in her seat, but said nothing. Dr. Sinclair, his face set in a grim expression, refused to meet Poirot's eyes. Poirot took a deep breath, allowing the silence to stretch. The truth, madame, monsieur, is close at hand. You all know it, but only by confronting it directly can we bring this matter to its conclusion. The connections between you all are deeper than you realize, and the commander's death is the culmination of something far greater than mere circumstance. He paused, his eyes flicking from one person to another. I do not ask these questions lightly. I ask them because the answers
are within you all, and it is only by revealing them that we can bring justice to Commander Duval's death. The room remained still, but Poirot could feel the tension beginning to crack. Someone was about to break. The game, he knew, was reaching its final, inevitable act. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The tension in the drawing room was palpable, thick enough to cut through. The faces of those present were taut with nerves, each one trying to suppress what Poirot knew was growing fear. The fear of the truth, the fear of what would happen once it all came crashing down. The storm outside, which had been raging for hours, now seemed to mirror the chaos within. Gregory Havisham was still standing by the window, his hands gripping the curtain as if it could somehow shield him from the pressure in the room. Eleanor Sinclair, sitting near the fire, kept her head down, her fingers nervously twisting the lace of her dress. Dr. Sinclair, as always, appeared composed, though his fingers betrayed him, tapping the armrest of his chair in a rhythm that spoke of mounting tension. Lady Imogen had become eerily quiet, her eyes darting around the room, not meeting anyone's gaze. The silence was thick, suffocating. Poirot observed them all, his mind working at full speed. He could feel the truth just beyond his reach, taunting him with its proximity. His eyes fell on Eleanor, and in that moment, he knew. He had pushed enough, observed enough. Someone was about to crack. The moment of reckoning had come. Eleanor stood abruptly, the sudden movement catching everyone's attention. Her body was tense, her face flushed, and her eyes wide with panic. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice quivering. "I can't keep pretending that I don't know what happened. She broke off, swallowing hard, as if the weight of her words were too much to bear. Gregory immediately stepped toward her, his voice sharp. "Eleanor, don't! Not now! Not here!" But Poirot's gaze was fixed on her, unwavering. "Madame Sinclair, it is time. The truth, it seems, can no longer be hidden, can it?" Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides. She glanced at Gregory, then back to Poirot, her expression filled with desperation. "You don't understand. You won't understand unless I tell you everything." She paused, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "I didn't mean for it to happen. None of this was supposed to happen, but I—" Poirot took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Madame Sinclair, please. Tell us what happened. You no longer need to hide. You are not alone in this." Eleanor's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. She took a step back, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want to destroy everything. But when he came, when Duval showed up with that letter, I couldn't stop it." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he took in her words. The letter. The one that had been missing. The one that had been central to the mystery all along. He had suspected its significance, but now he knew this was the key to everything. "You are speaking of the letter, no?" Poirot asked, his voice softer now, coaxing her to continue. Eleanor nodded, her face pale, lips trembling. "Yes, he had it, the letter. He came to confront us, to tell us that he would expose everything. He said he would ruin us. He said he had proof. Proof of what had happened between Gregory and me. That letter was the proof, and I couldn't let him destroy us." Gregory moved quickly toward her, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "Eleanor, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice low but filled with panic. "We don't need to talk about it." Poirot turned his sharp gaze on Gregory. "Monsieur Havisham, it is too late for such words. The truth is already in motion." Eleanor's sobs grew louder as she continued. I didn't know what to do. I begged him to leave us alone, but he wouldn't. He wouldn't listen. He said he'd expose everything, and I couldn't let him. I couldn't let everything I worked for, everything we've built, be ruined. So I didn't mean for it to happen, but I killed him." The words hung in the air like an electric charge, and the room seemed to freeze. Poirot had known, of course. He had suspected this very outcome, but hearing the truth spill from Eleanor's lips, felt like a weight lifting from the room. Gregory's face twisted in shock, and Dr. Sinclair's hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly. Lady Imogen was deathly still, her gaze fixed on her daughter-in-law, her face unreadable. "You killed him?" Poirot repeated softly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. His voice was gentle, almost reassuring. "But you did not do it out of malice. You did it because you believed there was no other way." Eleanor nodded weakly, her tears staining her cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted this. I just wanted him to go away." Poirot stepped closer, his tone kind but firm. "Madame Sinclair, you are not alone in this. You did what you thought was necessary, but the truth has a way of coming to light. It is time to face it, for all of us." Gregory stepped forward now, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You—" He stopped himself, his words faltering as the reality of the situation sank in. "You really killed him?" Eleanor's face crumpled again, her hands shaking as she wiped her eyes. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I swear to you I didn't mean to." Poirot took a deep breath, his mind already processing the confession. The mystery had come to an end, but the true unraveling was just beginning. Eleanor's confession was just the first step toward justice, but the journey ahead was still fraught with complications. The truth had been revealed, but it was not the end. It was merely the beginning of something much more complex, something that would require each of them to confront their past and their darkest secrets. Chapter 14. The Final Reckoning. The weight of Eleanor Sinclair's confession lingered in the air like a thick fog. The room had grown eerily quiet, save for the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Each person in the room seemed to retreat inward, the shock of the truth settling into their bones. Poirot stood still, his eyes never leaving Eleanor as she sat in front of him, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling in her lap. Gregory Havisham had taken a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. His gaze darted between Eleanor and Poirot, still processing the weight of her admission. Dr. Sinclair, too, was silent, his face a mask of stoic control, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the internal storm that raged within him. Lady Imogen, who had been so quiet through it all, now looked at her daughter-in-law, her expression a mixture of pity and resignation. Poirot broke the silence first, his voice calm, methodical. "Madame Sinclair, your actions, though driven by fear, were not without consequences, but you have been honest with us, and that is the first step toward understanding." Eleanor's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She still couldn't look anyone in the eye, as though the weight of the confession was too heavy for her to bear. "I didn't mean to do it. I thought if I just made him leave, everything would go back to normal." Gregory stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "You killed him because you were afraid. Is that it? You couldn't just talk to him, find another way?" Eleanor looked up at him, then her eyes full of regret. "I didn't know what else to do. He was going to ruin everything. I thought if I stopped him, Her words faltered as the reality of what she had done seemed to hit her all at once. Poirot glanced at Dr. Sinclair, who had not spoken since the confession. The doctor's gaze was fixed on Eleanor, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. The tension between them was palpable. Poirot knew that Dr. Sinclair was not only concerned for his family, but also for his own part in the unfolding events. "Monsieur Sinclair," Poirot said, his voice turning toward the doctor, "what do you make of all this?" Dr. Sinclair took a deep breath, his hands folding tightly in his lap. It's a tragedy. I understand her fear, but this is far beyond what I imagined." He paused, his voice growing softer. "I never wanted this to happen. None of us did." Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze flickering between the two of them. "And yet, despite the fear, there was another way. The truth could have come out, but the secrecy, the lies, those have only caused more harm." Gregory spoke again, his voice strained. "This doesn't make sense. We're all caught up in this web now, but why was he really here? Why did Duval come to our hotel? It wasn't just about a letter. He knew something more, didn't he? Something that could ruin us all." Poirot's eyes gleamed with understanding, and he took a step closer to the group. "Ah, Monsieur Havisham, you are correct. Duval knew something. He had come to confront the sins of the past, but also to reveal a deeper truth that connected all of you. The letter, as you now know, was only part of the puzzle. The true secret lay in the history that bound you all together. But what was his final purpose, and why did he choose this moment to expose it?" There was a long silence as Poirot's words sank in. Each person in the room seemed to be grappling with a different facet of the revelation. Lady Imogen looked to her son, then to Eleanor, and finally to Poirot, her expression one of defeat. Poirot turned his attention to her. "Madame, you have been silent for too long. Your connection to Duval, to all of this. It is crucial to understanding why he came here. You must speak the truth now." Lady Imogen's lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. Then, with a quiet sigh, she spoke. "He came here because of me. I had a past with him, a long time ago before I met my late husband. We had been involved briefly, but it ended badly. I thought I had buried that part of my life, but Duval didn't forget. He never forgot." The room fell silent again as Lady Imogen's words echoed in the air. It was clear now that the commander's arrival was no coincidence. He had come for something deeper than just revenge. He had come to unearth a past that none of them had wanted to face. Poirot's gaze never wavered as he spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "The past, madame, has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. But it is only by confronting it that we can move forward." Gregory and Dr. Sinclair exchanged glances, their faces hard to read, but both were clearly affected by the weight of Lady Imogen's confession. Eleanor's sobs had subsided into quiet sniffles, her face still pale, but she seemed to be absorbing what had been revealed. Poirot stepped back, taking in the room, allowing the weight of Lady Imogen's confession to settle over them. "Now we must finish what we started. The truth is out in the open, and with it, justice must follow." For the first time, the room seemed to breathe collectively, the air clearing as though the dam of secrets had finally cracked. Yet Poirot knew the end was not near. It was only the beginning. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The storm had passed, and the quiet that followed felt almost unnatural. Inside the Grand Havisham Hotel, the once bustling drawing-room was now eerily still. The tension that had plagued the room all evening had yet to dissipate, and every person present seemed weighed down by the revelations they had all been forced to confront. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his sharp eyes glancing over the assembled group. Lady Imogen, Gregory Havisham, Eleanor Sinclair, and Dr. Sinclair, all of them had been touched by this tragedy, each in their own way. And now it was time for the final gathering. The moment of truth. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet room. "Madame, Monsieur," Poirot began, his voice steady, "we have come to the end of our search for the truth. What began as a simple murder has become a tangled web of deceit, fear, and regret, and now we must face the consequences." Lady Imogen, her hands still trembling, met his gaze with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. She had confessed, and though the weight of her past had been revealed, there was still the matter of what came next. Poirot turned his attention to Gregory. The young man had been quiet since his mother's confession, and his usual bravado had faded into something more uncertain. The truth had shaken him to his core, and Poirot saw it in his eyes. Gregory Havisham's world had just been torn apart, and now he would have to face the fallout. Eleanor, sitting with her hands folded tightly in her lap, avoided looking at anyone. She had admitted to her involvement in the commander's death, and though the truth was out, the guilt still clung to her like a shadow. Dr. Sinclair, meanwhile, had not spoken much since his niece's confession. He sat stoically, his expression unreadable, but Poirot could sense the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. There was more to Dr. Sinclair than met the eye. There always had been. "I know that each of you has struggled to face what has happened," Poirot continued, his voice softening. "The truth has been a heavy burden, but it is a burden that must be borne if justice is to be done." Eleanor's voice broke the silence, quiet but firm. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Poirot paused for a moment before answering, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Now we allow the authorities to do their work. Justice in the end is not mine to deliver, but the truth we have uncovered tonight will not be ignored. It will be known." He turned to Gregory, then to Lady Imogen. "You must face the consequences of your actions, all of you, but do not forget that facing the truth, even when it is painful, is the only way to move forward." The room was still, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them. The truth had been laid bare, but the cost had been high. Yet Poirot knew, as always, that the burden of guilt was not something that could be avoided forever. It would be up to each of them to make peace with what they had done. And as Poirot turned to leave the room, he knew that justice would follow its course, no matter how long it took. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The following morning, the remnants of the storm still hung heavy in the air, the skies grey and unsettled. The Grand Havisham Hotel stood silent, its grand halls now seeming sombre in the wake of the previous night's revelations. The guests, though still shaken, had gathered in the drawing-room once again, this time with an undeniable air of resignation. They knew the truth had been exposed, but the weight of that truth was only beginning to settle. Poirot entered the room quietly, his presence as commanding as ever. His eyes swept over the group: Lady Imogen, Gregory Havisham, Eleanor Sinclair, and Dr. Sinclair, each of them worn from the emotional toll of the events that had transpired. Their faces were etched with the shadows of guilt, regret, and fear. For all the confession, for all the truths laid bare, none of them had truly found peace. "The time has come," Poirot said, his voice calm yet heavy with finality. He walked into the centre of the room, his hands folded behind his back as he took in the faces of the guests. To truly understand what has happened here, we must face the consequences of our actions, and we must also understand the full picture, the part of the story that until now has remained in the dark. Lady Imogen sat at the edge of her chair, her posture stiff, hands clenched in her lap. Gregory stood by the window, still gazing out into the quiet grounds, though his mind seemed 1,000 miles away. Eleanor, pale and withdrawn, sat beside her, her eyes focused on the floor. Dr. Sinclair, silent as always, remained distant, though his eyes flicked nervously between Poirot and the others. Poirot took a deep breath before continuing. "What we know now, what we have all revealed, is but a fragment of the truth. It is not enough to merely uncover the who and the why. We must understand the deeper motives, the connections that bind us all together." He looked first at Lady Imogen. "Madame, you confessed to your connection with Commander Duval, but you did not reveal the full extent of your relationship. Your past with him was not simply an affair. It was a bond, one that carried weight long after you thought it was over. The commander's return was not just a coincidence, was it?" Lady Imogen's breath caught in her throat, but she said nothing, her eyes downcast. Poirot turned to Gregory next, his eyes sharp. "Monsieur Havisham, you've been protective of your family, perhaps too protective, but your efforts to shield them have only made things worse. The commander came here with a specific purpose, to confront you, to confront the sins of the past, and your attempt to distance yourself from the truth only drove him further." Gregory's face flushed, but he remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides. Poirot then focused on Eleanor. "Madame Sinclair, you have carried a heavy burden. You killed Duval in fear and desperation, but it was not just his threats that pushed you to the edge. It was the years of living in the shadow of a secret, one that was never meant to be exposed. You acted to protect your family, but the consequences were far greater than you realized." Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears, but she said nothing, her body trembling. Finally, Poirot turned to Dr. Sinclair. "And you, Monsieur Sinclair, were caught between your duty as a physician and your loyalty to your family. Your actions have been calculated, but there is more at play here. Your silence, your refusal to speak the truth, has allowed this tragedy to unfold. You knew more than you were willing to admit, and in doing so, you allowed the lies to persist." Dr. Sinclair's face tightened, but he did not respond. Poirot stepped back, his eyes scanning the room one last time. The commander's death was not just a crime of passion or desperation. It was the result of years of hidden truths, unspoken resentments, and unacknowledged guilt. You each played a part in this tragedy, and now you must all live with the consequences. The room was heavy with the weight of his words. Each person sat in silence, the truth sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. There was no escape now, no way to undo what had been done. But there was a strange sense of finality in the air, a sense that the mystery had been solved, that the veil had been lifted. The truth was out, and though it had cost them all dearly, it was the only path forward. Poirot turned to the door, his work here done. Justice will take its course, and though you may not find peace, you will find a resolution. That is all we can hope for. And with that, he left the room, leaving the four guests to face the consequences of their actions. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The quiet aftermath of Poirot's departure lingered in the room like an echo of finality. No one spoke for several moments, each person lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the revelations, the heavy burden of guilt and consequence, pressed down on them all. The storm outside had finally cleared, but the storm within the walls of the Grand Havisham Hotel remained. Lady Imogen was the first to break the silence. Her voice was hoarse, as if the weight of her confession had drained her entirely. "What happens now?" she whispered, looking at her son, then at the others. Her question hung in the air, unanswered for the moment. Gregory stood by the window, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. He hadn't said a word since Poirot had left, but the tension in his shoulders told a story all its own. His gaze was focused on the distant horizon, as though searching for something he could never find. "We wait," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Justice will have to take its course. There's nothing more to be done." Eleanor sat in the chair by the fire, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes red from the tears she had shed. She had confessed, and yet the guilt still clung to her, heavier than ever. She didn't know what she expected, perhaps absolution, perhaps some form of forgiveness. But none of that would come. Not now. Not after what had happened. Dr. Sinclair, who had been silent throughout, stood up abruptly. "I will speak with the authorities," he said, his voice cold. "We can't avoid this any longer. We must face the consequences." Poirot's work was done. The truth was out, and the consequences would unfold in time. Justice would take its course, but the lives of those involved had already been irrevocably changed. And as Poirot had said, facing the truth was the only way forward, no matter the cost. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. The silence in the drawing-room deepened as each of them absorbed the consequences of the past few days. The weight of their collective guilt and the inevitable justice that would follow hung over them like a heavy cloud. The moment had come for the truth to be not just acknowledged, but faced, and each person present understood that no amount of denial could undo what had been done. Lady Imogen sat stiffly in her chair, her face a mask of exhaustion, her once proud posture slumped under the weight of revelation. She had confessed, yet still the burden felt too great to bear. Gregory stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes dark and distant. Eleanor's eyes were downcast, her hands resting limply in her lap, every inch of her body screaming for escape from the consequences she could not outrun. Dr. Sinclair, silent as always, stood near the doorway, his face unreadable, but his stance tense, as though waiting for something, anything, to change. Poirot re-entered the room, his presence as steady and unyielding as ever. He had witnessed their unravelling, seen the cracks in their facades, and now he stood as the final arbiter of what had transpired. He was no judge, but he knew that the truth was the first step toward any form of justice. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each of them. "The matter is finished," Poirot said, his voice firm but not without empathy. "The truth is out, and justice, in its own way, will follow." Gregory, who had been staring out the window, turned toward him. "What do you mean by that, Poirot? Will we be arrested? What happens now?" Poirot smiled faintly, though his eyes were filled with something more akin to sorrow than triumph. "The law will have its say, Monsieur Havisham. But as for you, as for all of you, your actions have already been judged. Now it is a matter of accepting what comes next." Lady Imogen, her voice barely a whisper, spoke up. "And what if we cannot live with it? What if we cannot bear the weight of what we've done?" Poirot's gaze softened, and for a moment the detective seemed more like a man offering solace than a solver of mysteries. "Madame, to live with the truth is the hardest thing one can do. But it is the only way forward. Whether you find peace is something only you can determine." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the room. "For now, you have all done what you could. Now you must face what comes with that." Poirot turned and walked toward the door, his mission completed. The mystery was solved, the truth had been revealed, and though the journey ahead for the Havishams and the Sinclairs was uncertain, the weight of their secrets had finally been lifted.